Welcome, I'm Dr Jenn Chubb, a research fellow at the University of York with XR Stories, where extended reality and storytelling meet. My research focuses on the impact of science and technology and the future of artificial intelligence. XR Stories is a £15 million research collaboration funded by the AHRC and the ERDF, and it's led by the University of York, the British Film Institute and Screen Yorkshire. At XR Stories, we're finding new ways to tell new stories to different audiences, and our research and development is focused on the future of immersive and interactive storytelling. My talk today is about AI and storytelling, and it's the close result of collaboration between computer science, the arts, the social sciences, and with industry. To set the scene, I invite you to bring to mind the most dominant narrative or perhaps a recent story you read or heard about AI. Where did you hear that story? Who told you it? How does it make you feel about AI? Chances are you may have brought many stories to mind, some fiction, some fact, and chances are you may be excited and perhaps a little concerned about this technology. Building on research already conducted in the field of AI narratives and our research into expert and public views of AI across a range of domains, such as education, health, and the creative sector, this talk is going to consider the role of storytelling in how we make sense of AI and consider some of the missing narratives. Stories can be important indicators of our future. Since the dawn of language, humans have made sense of the world using stories, narrating their experiences to understand the present and to shape the future. As technology advances, the limits of our imagination extend, and our expectations of the future are altered and reframed. This is the power of what Professor of Science and Technology Studies Sheila Yasanov refers to as socio-technical imaginaries. We might reframe these as narratives or stories, generating new visions which influence public perception and even public policy. So stories are a kind of glue. They open up new possibilities and perspectives, but they can also really divert and distract. In the case of AI, dominant stories often polarize towards notions of threat on the one hand, or a kind of myopic solutionism on the other. And yet AI is ubiquitous in our lives, including those of children, and it's important to get those stories right. For instance, 1 in 4 children between 5 and 16 years of age live in a household with a voice-activated virtual assistant in the UK. So as stories like imaginaries of metaverses emerge, understanding how these stories impact public perception and the extent to which we actually consider who's telling them and their narrative features, for example, the sound and the imagery used, becomes really important. Researchers are pretty fed up of seeing images like this accompanying public discourse around AI. In our research, we asked experts what they felt were the common narratives about AI, and many dismantled these grand narratives. Dominant narratives were for most based not on the reality of the state of the technology, but on the speculative imagination, often of science fiction authors. Participants referred regularly to the tendency for narratives to give rise to a sort of dystopian or extreme story about killer robot uprising, job losses, and existential risk. One expert told me how many may associate AI with highly anthropomorphized machines in a robot body. That is humanoid, working either as a servant or as a warrior killer robot kind of Terminator story. They either serve us and live with us, or they try to exterminate us. It's a very common and problematic narrative. These narratives were seen to be associated with fear, important perhaps when thinking about very serious risks posed by autonomous weapons and AI in warfare, for example, and the ethical implications of the dangerous effects on AI on privacy and surveillance, for instance, but not always as a general discourse. On the flip side, many talk about AI as though it's the solution to all of humanity's problems. Positive associations about increased efficiency for improved freedoms, where AI is the answer to climate change, and we've seen with the COVID-19 global health crisis, it's often been associated with much more positive framings. One of our participants described a problematic approach of this, though, as being the narrative that says AI is a silver bullet, it's going to solve these intractable political problems. And these dualities of light and dark, of course, can give us hope, but also dread, as researchers at Cambridge have written about extensively. Central storytellers about AI tend to be human. They think big technology, big tech, Silicon Valley, and authors of science fiction. These storytellers are often specific, though, to particular demographics and motivations. See here a white male. Many potential storytellers are excluded from creating new narratives and perspectives, and there is a need for a broader set of voices and ethics, therefore, to curtail the relentless profit motive of the big players in technology. But increasingly, and we see in XR stories, that stories are being told by AI itself, behind which, of course, are humans, at least for now in the case of narrow forms of AI. AI storytelling tools are ushering in a new era that includes creative characters and games and immersive experiences who have relationships and can adapt to react to how audiences play and interact with technology. AI is telling jokes. It can write songs, write a novel, paint a beautiful picture, but does it know it's beautiful? How well it can do this, you need to decide. It is getting better at it. In addition to the stories and the tellers that we talked about, there is a need to think about other narrative features, namely sound and image. For instance, there is currently a movement we're involved in to better explore images of AI, led by an organisation, We in AI, and the BBC and researchers from other universities. And they're interested to move away from the kinds of portrayals that you're seeing here. A far lesser explored, but equally important component of the way AI is expressed is its sonic portrayal. We know that music can be employed to frame how we feel about things and can be manipulated. As such, when we decide to use music to frame how we wish a piece of storytelling to be perceived, attention and scrutiny should be paid to the resonances and emotional overtones that music brings to a particular topic. I will play you one such sound in a moment. AI is, of course, a topic that is heavily subjected to hype. In our project, the AI What's That Sound project, we're interviewing composers, artists, and sound designers of AI documentary to see how they soundtrack AI. Can you bring to mind the voice of a human robot, the soundtrack of your favorite science fiction? All too often, music might inject false emotion. What is the function, for example, of a booming, calamitous impact sound signaling the obliteration of all humankind at the hands of a robot, if not to inject heightened emotion? So stories then, their features and who tells them are really important. I want to talk you through some missing narratives or lesser told stories about AI, and it's all based on our research. The first is a piece of research on conversational AI for children. So this project involved a collaboration with BAFTA award-winning digital agency Joy Poloi. This was an exciting project that used AI to extend the story world of children's TV shows beyond the screen. We developed a meta-story chat tool to allow children to safely engage with characters. So when an episode of their favourite show would end, children would be encouraged to speak to the characters, to reflect on their take on events, and to participate with suggestions and predictions for the next episode. And they're increasingly popular across the generations. These technologies are relatively opaque to the user. So what we did was we worked on understanding the effects of these systems on children's cognitive, social and linguistic development, and we aim to support the responsible development of this technology with respect to privacy, safety, security and access. Another missing or lesser told narrative concerns the amazing advancements in AI towards creativity and culture. The XR Story team are exploring how AI can be used in immersive storytelling, virtual reality, and audio. These innovations transform the face of creativity, innovation, and story making. At DC Labs, we have research strength in gaming and gamification. Here, AI is being used to revolutionize player experiences and the way games are developed. Reinforcement learning, for example, is an area of machine learning in which AI effectively teaches itself how to act through trial and error. In short, these gaming characters will mimic human players. To some extent, they will think. And another lesser told story about AI is actually about its role in science and education itself. We recently published a piece of research on the role of AI as an enabler of the research process. AI coming up with hypotheses and acting as a matchmaker in research to bridge disciplines and support research impact, a bit like what we're doing today. But of course, some stories are just not told because they pertain to the everyday, and yet our research shows that there's a need to focus on and gather niche, novel and nuanced stories, grounded far less in the spectacular and more in the everyday. One of our participants exclaimed, "A lot of the stories about AI are just going to be boring stories." One of our participants then went on to say that they just wanted AI to water their lawn for them. This notion of the mundane or contingent benefit is rarely celebrated because perhaps it just doesn't make for an excited or emotional storytelling experience. But finally, we really need to sit back and consider what stories about AI should not be told for the overall flourishing and happiness of humanity. What future do we actually want? Who do we include in that we? Wouldn't it be nice, said one of our participants, to turn the Zen setting up on our phones? So this is all suggestive of a need to pay closer attention to missing AI narratives to improve AI literacy and the public understanding of AI, showing both the opportunities and the downsides. Growing momentum about the ethics of AI can, of course, help the public better interrogate and reflect on what stories they hear about AI. And there are, of course, domains where the use of AI is higher stakes than others, and research is needed to tackle the implications of AI and its regulation now in particular areas, not later. So more work is required to consider the introduction of human biases and representation, as well as mitigating against unintended harm. And with respect to these narratives, it's not simply telling new stories. It's about listening to stories, asking what is wanted from AI by everyone and what is not wanted. It's about thinking how we sonically represent AI and how we visually represent it. Through this research, we call for realistic, nuanced and inclusive stories, working with and for diverse voices to represent collective visions. We hope that this will inspire young people and the next generation of thinkers, technologists and storytellers. Thank you.